you grew up in Newfoundland, Mark, as you just mentioned. How did you arrive at both jazz and the classics and the broad range of what you do? I mean, what path took you there? Did you study all these different things, or did you work them out?
Growing up in Newfoundland, if you own a violin, you can't possibly own a violin and not play Newfoundland fiddle music, which is really Irish music, Irish jigs and reels. And so I did a lot of that when I was young, although I started violin through classical training. And when I was about 10, through the marvel of public education in Newfoundland back in those days, where every school had a great music program, they really invested a lot of money in the public education system into great music programs. I had the opportunity of playing saxophone. And so I actually first learned how to play jazz on saxophone. And I didn't really start transferring any of that information into violin speak until I was about 15 or 16. And then it lay dormant for a while until I was in my mid-20s. And then I started picking it up a little bit more adventurously and starting playing more and more. But I was lucky. I had a father that was an Irish tenor. And so there was music around the house a lot. And I had the opportunity of hearing his voice. And my father loved listening to classical music. We always had classical music on in the house. And my brothers and sisters, who, of course, wanted to, I was the younger one, they wanted to rebel against that. So I also had a lot of heavy metal. And in the middle of all that, I had, some tapes of Grappelli that my violin teacher had recorded off of CBC radio, actually, from a long time ago, that I would listen to over and over and over again from broadcasts from Massey Hall and stuff. So the exposure was huge. And I was lucky. I was born into the right set of circumstances.
There's a lot of classical music in your house, I'd imagine, Graham Campbell. Would you say you are classically trained or otherwise?
I consider myself jazz trained with a classical upbringing, so definitely being exposed to lots of classical music growing up, starting on classical piano. But I think around the time I was 12 or 13, I was gravitating more toward jazz already. And I also started playing jazz on the trumpet first, before the guitar.
And how do you study jazz other than listening to lots of recordings?
Well, for me, I had teachers when I was in high school. I had some fantastic teachers. And then practicing and listening all the time was a big part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of listening that has to go into it rather than read out. That's the big difference between a lot of classical playing and a lot of jazz playing. A classical player will put something in front of them, and they can be technically incredible and maybe sight read it perfectly, but it might not be part of the ear's process. It would be something very visually stimulated. So, there's a lot of air just because of the exposure you were mentioning, like exposure to different sounds as a kid that really developed the ear over and over.
What does jazz give you that the classical side of things doesn't?
There's a very different rhythmic sense, I find. For me, classical music has more of an elastic kind of feeling where you can mold the ups and downs and interpret it much differently that way. But with jazz, it's more of a groove. It's kind of an internal groove, a more steady sort of rhythm. And there's a lot of rhythmic interpretation in jazz too, but that kind of has more to do with how how you shape the linear lines and what we would call the swing feel. So it can be highly swung or it can be straight, and that's kind of two different sides of the spectrum. And you kind of have to find where you fall in between.
I think that's a great description of it. I completely agree. I often think to myself, it would be great if string quartets would go out on stage, and when they're ready to start their first movement of Haydn Opus 77, number 1, they would go, a 1, a 2. I'm not feeling it yet. No. Okay, a 1. You got it? I got it. Okay, 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. And then they're carrying it, right? And jazzers, of course, do that right away. It's like, okay, we're going to feel it first, and then we're going to sound it. And classical people often don't really do that. They go, and then dive into this big pool of possibility.
Or
And
they
of
wait
course,
for the conductor.
all that, that's right.
Yeah.
But it's a very different experience that way, and the feeling of rhythm. I totally agree with what you said, Graham. I think that was brilliant. Like the
And
feeling of rhythm is really where it's different.
Something that we do a lot when I'm jamming with my friends and at my house just for fun when we're playing some jazz. We'll turn on a metronome before we start and kind of feel a tempo, and then we'll play for maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll stop and we'll turn the metronome on and see if we're still playing at the same tempo that we started at.
Yes, yes.
And that's a big goal / challenge for jazz musicians, is to be able to keep that steady tempo, and that's a big focus of the music, which I think is a big difference between jazz and classical music.
Yes. And Mark, you mentioned the word freedom earlier. Freedom, in this case, I guess, within the improvisation. Obviously, that's stronger in jazz.
Yes, although within the last 20 years or so, we've seen a veritable explosion in the Baroque music world, which has opened up a similar door of exploration. And that's another field of music I just adore, particularly because of the freedom allowed. So a lot of old manuscripts from the 1600s that don't have full answers in front of you, you have to bring your own devices to them and recreate or co-create the production of a piece of Veracini or Handel or Gimignani or Pandolfi or whoever. And I think that, for me, is very much akin to taking a lead sheet in the jazz world and looking at the chord changes, looking at the concepts of the melody line, and then branching out from that and seeing what you find.
A lot of the Baroque side of things has to be studied, doesn't it? It's actual music history, let's say.
Absolutely.
You've got to,
I think it's the
dig
same
deep.
though. I think it's the same though in the jazz world. You need to study different styles of different players, and you need to spend some time. I mean, I spent at one point I was spending a lot of time, and I wish I could do this a lot more, transcribing solos of people like Stuff Smith or Stephane Grappelli, because that is the best way to digest. At least I found that to be the best way.
Yeah, I think most experts would agree.
Yeah, the best way to digest the information and to really have it available to you for your use.
That's
is
hard to
through that
do. You
transcription.
slow it down to sort of half speed and transcribe?
Do you use a program to slow it down?
Sometimes I do that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I do the same. Yeah, there's a computer program you can use.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very neat too because you can slow it down and be listening to all this information at half speed, and there'll be so much more information that your ear is picking up at half speed than you would have heard at full speed.
Yeah.
We had
Very
a
interesting.
we had a guest at Humber College when I was a student there, who came to talk. The great Dave Liebman, who used to play with Miles Davis, the saxophone player,
Wow.
and he gave a whole clinic on transcribing, and his advice was to learn to sing the whole thing first, and then after you learn to sing it, write it down, and then after you've written it down, then play it as the final step.
You know, it's funny. I just spoke to a cellist friend of mine who said that that's exactly how they learn a new concerto. That they get the score of it and they'll sing it to themselves first, and then they'll start writing it out, and then they'll start playing it. It's very interesting.
Well, but let's leave it there, sort of with the thought of you both singing the music and then transcribing it for your own instruments. It's time to move back to the 30s and 40s, and I'll let you get ready for this tribute to the Hot Club de France.
Thank you, Keith.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
Keith.
you.
Enjoy the
Graham
show.
Campbell, Mark Fewer.